The crystal flute in my hand didn't just slip, it felt as though the gravity in the ballroom had suddenly tripled, pulling my heart toward the polished marble floor. My husband, the man I had spent 12 years building a life with, stood on the stage under the warm glow of the spotlight, his arm draped casually around his boss's shoulders as he laughed into the microphone. "And if you think that's impressive," he chuckled, his voice echoing through the silent crowd of his colleagues, "you should see how my wife managed to borrow the blueprints for the Sterling project from a junior intern just to get the deposit before the firm noticed." The air left the room in a collective, horrified gasp, and as the CEO's eyes narrowed with a lethal coldness, I realized that Mark hadn't just told a tasteless joke. He had spent the last 6 months carefully forging my signature on documents that would ensure I never worked as an architect in this city again, all to clear the path for his own ascent. He wasn't just mocking me, he was publicly executing my reputation to prove his loyalty to a company that valued ruthlessness over blood. Long before the silence of that ballroom swallowed me whole, my life had been a meticulously designed sanctuary. I am an architect, and I have always believed that if the foundation is solid, the structure can withstand any storm. Our home, a sprawling mid-century modern jewel nestled in the hills, was my greatest achievement. I remember the smell of the damp earth the day we broke ground, a rich, loamy scent that promised a lifetime of security. I had designed every inch of it, from the floor-to-ceiling windows that captured the bruised purple of the sunset to the hidden studio where I spent my nights drafting dreams into reality. For years, our life was a symphony of quiet, domestic successes. We had a rhythm that felt unbreakable. Every morning at 6 a.m., the smell of freshly ground dark roast coffee would drift through the house, and Mark would find me in the kitchen, already hunched over my tablet. He would lean against the quartz countertop, the one I'd spent 3 weeks sourcing from a quarry in Italy, and watch me with a gaze that I mistook for adoration. "You're working too hard, Elle," he'd say, his voice smooth and comforting, like aged bourbon. He would press a kiss to the top of my head, his fingers lingering on my shoulder just long enough to make me feel anchored. At the time, I didn't see the way his eyes would wander to my screen, scanning the figures of my latest commissions, or the way his jaw would tighten whenever I mentioned a new high-profile client. Mark was a senior project manager at Miller and Associates, a firm that prided itself on being the Shark Tank of the industry. He was charming, handsome, and possessed a magnetic personality that could sell ice to an Arctic explorer. But while he had the charisma, I had the technical brilliance. I was the one who pulled the strings behind the scenes, often ghostwriting his technical reports or fixing the structural flaws in the projects his team was supposed to oversee. I did it gladly. I thought we were a team. I thought that by lifting him up, I was strengthening the walls of our own home. The cracks began to form, almost imperceptibly, when Victoria Miller entered our orbit. Victoria, the CEO of his firm, was a woman who wore ambition like a sharpened blade. She began showing up at our house for strategic dinners, her presence always signaled by the oppressive, cloying scent of Chanel No. 5 and the click of her stiletto heels on my reclaimed oak floors. Mark would become a different person around her, stiff, eager to please, his laughter sounding a pitch too high and hollow. I remember one specific evening, about 4 months before the party. We were sitting on the terrace, the air thick with the scent of blooming jasmine. Victoria was swirling a glass of vintage Bordeaux, her eyes roaming over the house with a predatory appreciation. "It's a magnificent property, Elena," she said, her voice a low, calculated purr. "Mark tells me you did it all yourself. It's a shame your little boutique firm doesn't have the scale to handle something like the Sterling project. A project of that magnitude requires a firm with real teeth, a firm that knows how to protect its assets." I felt a slight chill, despite the warm night air. The Sterling project was my white whale, a multi-million-dollar redevelopment of the city's historic waterfront. I had been working on the bid for a year. It was my ticket to the national stage. "Scale isn't everything, Victoria," I replied, keeping my voice steady. Precision and integrity usually win the day. Mark let out a sharp, nervous laugh, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. But his grip was uncharacteristically tight, almost painful. Elle is a romantic, he said, looking at Victoria with a strange, pleading intensity. She still thinks the best design wins. She doesn't realize that, in the real world, it's about who holds the deed. At the time, I dismissed it as corporate posturing. I didn't notice the way Victoria's eyes lingered on the folder of blueprints I'd left on the side table. I didn't see the silent look of understanding that passed between my husband and his boss, a look that suggested they were already discussing the deed to my life. Over the following weeks, the atmosphere in our sanctuary began to shift. The warm amber light of our home felt colder, more sterile. Mark began asking questions about my firm's financial structures, questions he'd never cared about before. He offered to help out with my filing, claiming he wanted to take the administrative burden off my plate so I could focus on the Sterling bid. I was touched. I was exhausted. I was a fool. I handed him the keys to my digital life. I gave him access to my signatures, my contracts, and my trust. I thought I was letting him in. I didn't realize I was handing him the sledgehammer he needed to tear everything down. He became increasingly secretive, taking calls in the middle of the night, his voice a low murmur that stopped the moment I entered the room. When I asked him what was wrong, he would just rub his eyes and sigh, playing the role of the overworked executive to perfection. "Just corporate politics, Elle," he'd mutter, avoiding my gaze. "Victoria is pushing everyone to the limit. I'm just trying to make sure we're taken care of. Everything I do for us." I believed him. Even when I found a strange document in the trash, a power of attorney form with my name on it, which he quickly explained away as a template he'd been using for a client. I believed him even as the subtle cracks in our foundation grew into yawning chasms, because I couldn't imagine a world where the man I loved was the one planting the explosives. As the night of the corporate party approached, Mark was uncharacteristically giddy. He insisted on buying me a new dress, a stunning emerald green silk gown that felt like a second skin. "Tonight is the night everything changes," he told me, fastening a diamond necklace around my throat. His hands were shaking slightly, but I thought it was just nerves. I thought he was finally getting the promotion he'd worked so hard for. I stood in front of the mirror, looking at the woman I had become, successful, loved, and standing on the precipice of my greatest professional triumph. I didn't know that the man standing behind me, admiring my reflection, was already calculating the cost of my ruin. I didn't know that the change he promised wasn't a promotion, but a betrayal so deep it would leave me breathless in a room full of strangers, watching my world burn under the ballroom lights. The weeks leading up to the annual gala felt like walking through a house where the floorboards had begun to rot beneath the carpet. On the surface, everything remained pristine, but every step I took felt slightly unstable. Mark was no longer just helping with my files. He had become a gatekeeper. Whenever I reached for my tablet to review the final revisions for the Sterling project, he was there, gently sliding it away, offering a glass of wine or a distraction. "You're obsessing, Elle," he would say, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "The design is perfect. You need to rest your mind so you can be sharp for the presentation next week. Let me handle the mundane stuff. I've already sent the digital copies to the printing house for the boards." "The printing house? Which one, Mark?" "I usually use Miller's Graphics," I'd ask, a small knot of unease tightening in my stomach. "I found a better place. High-end, more exclusive. Victoria suggested them," he'd reply casually, already turning back to his own laptop. I should have pushed. I should have demanded the name. But I was exhausted, and I trusted the man who had held me through every failure and success for over a decade. Then came the phone calls. They always happened after 11 p.m. Mark would slip out of bed, the mattress shifting as he moved with a ghost-like silence I hadn't known he possessed. I would hear the balcony door click shut, and then the low, rhythmic hum of his voice against the backdrop of the crickets. One night, curiosity finally overrode my respect for his privacy. I crept toward the glass door, my bare feet silent on the cold wood. Through the thin gap, his words cut through the night air like a shard of glass. "No, she hasn't noticed. She thinks I'm just being a supportive husband," he whispered, a chuckle vibrating in his chest, a sound that felt entirely foreign to me. "The signatures are perfect. By the time the board sees the original drafts, she'll be the one looking like the amateur. Just make sure the promotion is finalized before the announcement, Victoria. I'm not doing this for a pat on the back." I froze. My breath caught in my throat, a physical weight pressing down on my lungs. The signatures, Victoria, promotion. The words swirled in my head, refused to settle into a logical pattern. Was he talking about me? He couldn't be. He was my partner. He was my home. The next morning, the unease had blossomed into a full-scale panic. Mark had left early for a pre-gala briefing, leaving his study door ajar. A rare oversight. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, rhythmic thudding that made my ears ring. I walked into the room, the air smelling of his expensive cologne and stale coffee. His desk was meticulously clean, but his secondary laptop, the one he used for overflow work, was sitting on the charging dock. My fingers trembled as I opened the lid. It was password protected, but Mark was predictable. He used the coordinates of the first house I'd ever designed, a set of numbers I'd joked were our lucky charm. The screen flickered to life, and my stomach turned a slow, agonizing somersault. There, on the desktop, was a folder titled Sterling Transition. Inside weren't just my designs. They were altered versions of them. My sleek, sustainable waterfront layout had been stripped of its core innovations, replaced with cheaper, more profitable alternatives that bore the Miller and Associates logo. But that wasn't the worst part. I opened a document titled Internal Memo Ethical Violation Report. My eyes blurred as I read the words. It was a formal complaint, addressed to the city's architectural board, alleging that I, Elena Vance, had knowingly used stolen proprietary data from Miller and Associates to build my bid for the Sterling project. Attached to the memo were scans of my own sketches, but the timestamps had been digitally backdated to appear as though they originated from Mark's firm months before I'd even started my draft. At the bottom of the document was my signature. It looked perfect, the way I always looped the E, the specific slant of the V, but I had never signed this. I had never even seen it. The room began to spin. A cold, metallic taste filled my mouth, and I had to reach out and grab the edge of the mahogany desk to keep from collapsing. The floor felt like it was liquefying. My pulse was a deafening roar in my head, a frantic thump, thump, thump that seemed to shake the very walls I had built. I felt a wave of nausea so violent I had to squeeze my eyes shut and pray I wouldn't vomit on the rug. He wasn't just stealing my work. He was setting me up to take the fall for a crime he was committing. He was destroying my career to secure his own seat at Victoria's table. "Looking for something, Elle?" I jumped, the laptop nearly sliding off the desk. Mark was standing in the doorway. He wasn't wearing his supportive husband mask anymore. His expression was blank, his eyes as hard and unreflective as two pieces of flint. He didn't look guilty. He looked annoyed that he'd been caught before the big reveal. "Mark, what is this?" I managed to whisper, my voice cracking, barely audible over the blood rushing in my ears. "The memo, the backdated files. You forged my name." He walked into the room, his movements slow and deliberate, like a predator who knew the prey had nowhere to run. He closed the laptop lid with a soft, final click. "I didn't forge anything, Elena," he said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "I'm just doing what's necessary. Your firm was never going to win that contract. You're too small. You're too idealistic. I'm saving the project. And in exchange, Miller and Associates is giving us a life you couldn't even dream of." "By ruining me?" I shouted, the shock finally giving way to a white-hot spark of fury. "You're accusing me of fraud. You're going to get my license revoked." "Don't be dramatic," he snapped. waving a hand dismissively. Once the scandal dies down, you can work for me. We'll be the ultimate power couple. But first, you need to play your part. Tonight is about the firm. You're going to go to that party, you're going to wear that dress, and you're going to smile while I take my place at the top. I'm not going anywhere with you, I spat, my hands shaking so violently I had to tuck them into my armpits. Mark stepped closer, his shadow falling over me, cold and suffocating. Oh, you are going, Elena. Because if you don't, I'll release those documents to the board tomorrow morning instead of waiting for the internal review. You have two choices. Go to the party and let this play out as a misunderstanding that we can fix later or lose everything before the sun comes up. I looked at him, really looked at him, and realized that the man I had loved was a phantom. The person standing in front of me was a stranger who had spent years studying my weaknesses just so he could use them as leverage. You're a monster, I whispered. I'm a realist, he corrected, checking his watch. The car will be here in 3 hours. Make sure you look your best. Victoria hates it when people look distressed. He turned and walked out, leaving me alone in the wreckage of my life. I stood there for a long time, the silence of the house pressing in on me like a physical weight. My heart was no longer racing. It had turned into a cold, hard stone in my chest. He thought he had trapped me. He thought he had designed a cage I couldn't escape. But he forgot one thing. I'm an architect. I know how to find the flaws in any structure, and I was about to find the one that would bring his entire world crashing down around him. The silence that followed Mark's words was not empty. It was heavy, suffocating, and charged with the electricity of 100 judging eyes. I stood frozen at the edge of the stage, the emerald silk of my dress suddenly feeling like a shroud. The glass I had dropped lay in glittering shards at my feet, reflecting the harsh overhead lights. Mark didn't even look at me. He was too busy basking in the appreciative smirk Victoria Miller was throwing him from the front row. A joke, of course, Mark added, his voice booming through the speakers as he saw the CEO's calculating smile. But in this business, talent is nothing without the right management. To Miller and Associates. He raised his glass, and like a flock of well-trained birds, the room erupted into polite, forced applause. I turned and fled. I didn't care who saw me. I pushed through the heavy velvet curtains into the service corridor, my lungs burning as if I'd been submerged in ice water. I found myself in a small, dimly lit boardroom at the back of the venue. I leaned against the mahogany table, my breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. My mind was racing, trying to find a thread to pull on, a way to unravel the nightmare. Elena, don't be so dramatic. I spun around. Mark had followed me, closing the door behind him with a soft, ominous thud. He was loosening his tie, his face flushed with the adrenaline of his performance. Dramatic, I whispered, my voice trembling with a rage so cold it felt like liquid nitrogen. You just told the most influential people in our industry that I am a thief. You just destroyed 12 years of my work in 12 seconds. I secured our future, he snapped, stepping into the light. The mask of the loving husband was gone, replaced by a sharp, jagged ambition that made him look like a stranger. Victoria was wavering on the promotion. She needed to know I was 100% hers. She needed to know that even you, my own wife, wouldn't stand in the way of the firm's dominance. Is that what you call it? I stepped toward him, my hands balled into fists. What about the forgery, Mark? What about the backdated files on your laptop? I saw them. I know what you did. He didn't flinch. In fact, he smiled, a thin, cruel line that didn't reach his eyes. You saw the files? Good. Then you know how thorough I've been. But you didn't see everything, did you? He pulled his phone from his pocket and tapped a few buttons before sliding it across the polished table toward me. My heart hammered against my ribs as I looked at the screen. It was a bank statement. My private business account, the one I used for the firm's payroll and taxes, had been drained. What is this? I breathed, the world tilting on its axis. It's the first twist, Elle, he said, his voice dropping to a low conversational tone. I didn't just borrow your designs. I've been moving your liquid assets into a joint offshore account for months, an account that Victoria has shared oversight of as part of my equity buy-in for the partnership. Legally, that money is now company capital. The nausea returned, more violent than before. You stole my money to buy your way into her firm? I invested our money, he corrected. But here's the second twist, the one you're really going to hate. Do you remember those vitamin supplements I've been giving you for your stress? The ones you've been taking every morning? I stared at him, my mind flashing back to the small white pills he'd insisted would help with my late-night anxiety. What were they, Mark? A very specific low-grade sedative mixed with a mild hallucinogen, he said calmly. Nothing dangerous, just enough to make you a little forgetful. A little erratic. I've been keeping a log of your outbursts. I've even recorded a few of our arguments where you sound quite delusional. If you try to fight this, if you try to go to the police or the board, Victoria and I have a dozen witnesses who will swear you've been suffering a mental breakdown for months. The forgery? We'll just say you did it yourself in a fit of paranoia to protect your work from imaginary spies. The sheer, calculated cruelty of it took my breath away. He hadn't just betrayed me. He had been gaslighting me, drugging me, and preparing a cage of insanity to lock me in if I ever dared to speak up. The door opened again, and Victoria Miller stepped in, the scent of her perfume hitting me like a physical blow. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and contempt. He really is quite brilliant, isn't he, Elena? She said, walking over to stand beside Mark. She placed a hand on his arm, a gesture of possession that was unmistakable. He told me you'd be a problem, but I didn't think you'd be this easy to dismantle. You have no money, no reputation, and by tomorrow morning, you'll have no home. Mark has already signed the papers to put the house up as collateral for the Sterling Project's insurance bond. I looked at Mark, waiting for him to say something, anything, to defend the life we'd built. But he just stood there, his eyes downcast, his body language that of a loyal dog, waiting for its mistress to give the next command. He was paralyzed by his own greed, a hollow shell of the man I thought I knew. You won't get away with this, I said, though my voice sounded small, even to my own ears. We already have, Victoria replied, her voice as sharp as a razor. Now, you have two choices. You can walk back out there, apologize for your unfortunate episode at the stage, and we'll arrange for a quiet, private facility where you can recover while Mark handles the divorce. Or you can leave now with nothing but the dress on your back, and we will make sure the board bans you for life before the sun comes up. Mark finally looked up, his eyes glassy and devoid of any warmth. Just do what she says, Elle. It's better this way, for everyone. I looked from Mark to Victoria, the two people who had conspired to strip me of my work, my money, and my very identity. I felt the familiar sting of tears, the urge to collapse and beg for mercy. But then, something shifted. Deep inside, beneath the layer of drugs and betrayal, a spark of the woman who had built that house, who had designed that waterfront, flickered to life. It wasn't a hot, screaming rage. It was cold. It was architectural. I began to look at them not as my husband and his boss, but as a structure with a fatal flaw. And I realized that in their arrogance, they had forgotten the most important rule of design. Every load-bearing wall has a breaking point. You're right, Mark, I said, my voice suddenly steady, the trembling in my hands ceasing entirely. I should have known you were more interested in the deed than the design. I reached up and unfastened the diamond necklace, the one he'd bought with my own stolen money, and dropped it onto the table. It hit the wood with a hollow, pathetic click. Keep the house, I said, looking him straight in the eye. Keep the money, keep the firm. Because while you were busy stealing my past, you completely forgot to secure your future. I turned and walked out of the room, leaving them standing in their stolen empire. I didn't head for the exit. I headed for the coat check, where my purse and the small encrypted flash drive I'd hidden in the lining 3 hours ago was waiting. They thought they had destroyed me, but they had only succeeded in taking away the things I could rebuild. They had no idea that the real Sterling project hadn't even begun yet. The night air was a shock to my system, a cold, sharp blade that sliced through the haze of the sedatives and the crushing weight of the betrayal. I didn't go back to the house, our house, which I now realized was a crime scene of my own life. Instead, I drove straight to a 24-hour urgent care clinic. My hands were steady on the wheel, steered by a mechanical, icy resolve. "I need a full toxicology screen," I told the nurse, my voice sounding like it belonged to a stranger. "I believe I've been being drugged by a family member. I need the results documented for a legal case." The nurse's eyes widened, her gaze shifting to my expensive, rumpled silk dress and the shards of glass still embedded in the hem. She didn't ask questions. She saw the look in my eyes, the look of a woman who had reached the absolute end of her patience. As the needle pierced my skin, I didn't flinch. I watched the dark red blood fill the vial, thinking of it as the first piece of evidence in the dismantling of Mark's empire. The next call was to Toby, the junior intern Mark had so callously mocked on stage. I found him sitting in a 24-hour diner, staring into a cup of black coffee, his face pale and eyes rimmed with red. "He's going to fire me, Elena," Toby whispered as I slid into the booth across from him. "He told me if I said a word about the server logs, he'd make sure I never worked in this city again." "Toby, look at me," I said, leaning forward. The smell of grease and cheap coffee was a grounding contrast to the expensive lies of the ballroom. "Mark doesn't have the power to fire anyone anymore, because you and I are going to show the board what was actually on those server logs before he sanitized them." Toby's hands shook as he pulled a battered laptop from his backpack. "He thought he deleted the version history, but I'm the one who set up the cloud backup, Elena. He never even looked at the admin settings. I have everything, the original designs, the backdated timestamps, and the email chain between him and Victoria Miller discussing the liquidation of your accounts." I felt a surge of something I hadn't felt in years, a pure, unadulterated sense of power. Not the kind Mark craved, built on theft and shadows, but the kind that comes from the truth. The transformation was complete. The idealistic romantic Mark thought he could crush was gone. In her place was an architect who had found the fatal flaw in the building and was ready to pull the trigger on the controlled demolition. The retribution came 10 days later, in the hallowed, wood-paneled boardroom of the City Planning Commission. It was the final hearing for the Sterling project. Victoria and Mark were there, sitting side by side, looking like the victors of a war they thought they'd already won. Mark looked smug, a new platinum watch glinting on his wrist, no doubt bought with my money. As the chairman prepared to sign the final contract, I walked through the double doors. I wasn't wearing silk this time. I was wearing a sharp charcoal gray suit, my hair pulled back in a severe professional knot. "I'm sorry to interrupt," I said, my voice projecting with a clarity that silenced the room. "But there is a matter of proprietary theft and criminal fraud that this commission needs to review before a single cent of public money is awarded to Miller and Associates." Victoria stood up, her face a mask of feigned concern. "Elna, dear, we talked about this. You're not well. You should be at the facility." "I'm quite well, Victoria," I interrupted, walking to the head of the table. I signaled to Toby, who was waiting at the back with a projector. "In fact, I have a toxicology report from the night of your gala that shows high levels of unprescribed sedatives in my system. Sedatives my husband, Mark, has been administering to me for months to ensure I wouldn't notice he was draining my firm's accounts to fund your equity buy-in." The room went deathly silent. Mark's face went from smug to a sickly, grayish green in a matter of seconds. "And here," I continued, as Toby flicked a switch, "are the server logs from Mark's personal computer. They show the exact moment he opened my encrypted files, the moment he forged my digital signature, and the email from Victoria Miller promising him a junior partnership in exchange for the delivery of the Sterling designs." Mark tried to speak, but no sound came out. He looked at Victoria, his eyes wide and pleading, begging for her to save him. But Victoria Miller was a shark, and she knew when the water was full of blood. She took one look at the documents on the screen and physically recoiled from Mark, sliding her chair away as if his failure were contagious. "I had no idea," she stammered, her voice high and frantic. "Mark told me these were his designs. He told me his wife was incapacitated. I was trying to help him." Mark's head snapped toward her, his mouth agape. "Victoria, you told me to do it. You said we needed her out of the way." "I have the recordings of those conversations too, Victoria," I said, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. Toby was very thorough with the office intercom system. The fallout was spectacular. The commission didn't just reject the bid. They blacklisted Miller and Associates from all future city contracts. By that evening, the police had served warrants for Mark's arrest on charges of fraud, assault, and grand larceny. Victoria Miller was forced into a voluntary resignation by her board of directors 48 hours later, her reputation in the industry effectively incinerated. 6 months later, I stood on the waterfront, the wind whipping my hair across my face. The Sterling project was finally underway, but the sign at the entrance didn't say Miller and Associates. It bore the name of my new firm, Vance and Associates. I had lost the house in the hills. It had been sold to cover the legal fees and the restitution for the clients Mark had defrauded. But standing here, watching the cranes lift the first steel beams of my design into the sky, I realized I didn't miss it. That house had been a museum of a marriage that never truly existed. I looked down at the documents in my hand, the final permits for the waterfront park. My signature was there, bold and clear, and this time, it was the only one that mattered. Mark was serving a 3-year sentence in a minimum security facility, and Victoria was tied up in a dozen civil lawsuits that would likely leave her bankrupt. I took a deep breath, the air smelling of salt and wet concrete, the scent of a new foundation. I had spent my life building structures for other people, thinking that's where my security lived. But as I watched the sunset turn the river into a ribbon of gold, I finally understood the truth. A house is just wood and stone, and a marriage can be as fragile as glass. But a woman who knows how to design her own escape, she is the only structure that can never be torn down. I turned away from the site and headed toward my car, ready to go home to a place that wasn't a sanctuary, but a starting point. In the end, Mark was right about one thing. It's all about who holds the deed. And for the first time in my life, I finally held mine.